The night sky over the Pacific was unlike any other. The stars above, typically a calming sight, felt distant and detached as the rumbling of aircraft engines shattered the silence. It was August 1944, and the waters off the coast of the Pacific Islands were bathed in the eerie glow of searchlights and tracer rounds from the relentless barrage of battle. This was the theater of war where humanity's darkest instincts and deepest despair met in an unforgiving struggle for survival. The crackling sounds of machine guns and the thundering roar of bombers overhead seemed almost endless. On the ground, soldiers scrambled under the dense canopy of trees, sweating, fearing, and praying for an end to the fighting. Amid the chaos of war, a quiet moment was found in the kitchens of military camps far away from the front lines, where soldiers and officers huddled over makeshift tables to receive their meals. These meals, although basic, were a small glimpse of the comfort that soldiers clung to during the long stretches of war. The food, even in its simplest form, became something more than nourishment. It was a reminder of home, of normalcy, and of survival. Yet for the Japanese women officers stationed on remote islands, the notion of how the enemy, the Americans, fed their soldiers would come to be a jarring revelation, one that left them questioning the very essence of warfare. The backdrop of this moment is critical. World War II was in full swing, and both the Allies and Axis powers were locked in a conflict that spanned continents, leaving nothing untouched. It had been a brutal 6 years since the war began, and as the conflict continued, every facet of war, tactical decisions, leadership styles, and even the resources allocated to armies, came under scrutiny. From massive tank battles to aerial dogfights, each new technological advance seemed to tilt the balance of power slightly toward one side or the other. However, the psychological impact of war, the day-to-day experiences of soldiers, and the human cost of global conflict are often forgotten amidst the large-scale battles. In the Pacific Theater, particularly, the Japanese were entrenched in island-hopping campaigns, where every piece of land became fiercely contested. The Japanese military, led by its imperial army, had committed itself to the defense of its empire, and yet, as the war wore on, the struggle for resources, food, and manpower began to take its toll. With each battle, soldiers were pushed to their physical and mental limits. The hardships faced by the Japanese officers, both male and female, were no different. At times, their only sustenance came from whatever could be sourced from the islands, leaving little room for comfort. But as the Japanese military made its stand against American forces, little did they know that their perception of warfare, especially in the realm of logistics and military conduct, was about to be profoundly challenged. It was not only the weapons, tactics, and strategy that defined the outcome of this war. It was the perception of the enemy and the methods they employed, from the way they fought to the way they cared for their own soldiers. The American forces, in stark contrast to the Japanese, managed a sophisticated supply chain that ensured soldiers were consistently provided with food, equipment, and medical supplies. The logistics were the lifeblood of the Allied effort in the Pacific, where timely shipments from the mainland kept soldiers fed and armed as they fought island to island. But it wasn't just the quantity of food that stood out. It was the variety and quality that stunned the Japanese officers when they learned that the same food was served not only to American soldiers but also to those considered enemies, prisoners of war. The Japanese women officers, some of whom had been raised in a fiercely hierarchical and austere environment, could hardly comprehend the idea that the American enemy would feed its soldiers, let alone its prisoners, with the same level of care. The contrast was stark. Their own soldiers were often relegated to meager rations, while prisoners of war on the American side seemed to be treated with a level of humanity that, to them, seemed utterly alien. The very notion seemed to defy the harsh, unforgiving nature of war that they had grown accustomed to. As the war raged on, this revelation would serve as a point of reflection and, in some ways, would highlight the profound differences in how the two forces approached both warfare and humanity. This was a world where life and death were measured in seconds, and the psychology of war became just as crucial as the physical tools of battle. Both sides had long endured the destruction of their cities, the loss of millions of lives, and the exhaustion of their resources. Yet the battle over the treatment of prisoners, the value placed on human life, and the ethical considerations in combat would leave lasting scars on both sides. As the Americans prepared for the next great leap in their campaign to defeat the Japanese Empire, they were unknowingly about to force a confrontation on an entirely different level, a psychological one. The clash of ideals, the stark contrast in military conduct, would soon take center stage as these revelations emerged from within the Japanese ranks. It was in this charged atmosphere of conflicting philosophies, ideals and strategies that the Americans, seemingly unbothered by their enemies' perception of them, would continue to advance, unaware that their very treatment of prisoners of war would become an unexpected and profound point of contention. The war, though raging on all fronts, had now crossed a new threshold, one where ideas, perceptions, and morality itself would play as much of a role in victory as the bombs that fell and the battles fought. The war that had raged across the globe was now in its latter stages, but the Pacific theater, with its vast distances and intense engagements, remained one of the most brutal. The year was 1944, and the island-hopping strategy that had been the cornerstone of American military efforts was slowly strangling Japan's ability to defend itself. The Japanese, once confident in their imperial expansion, were now on the defensive. For every island that fell into Allied hands, the grip of the empire weakened, and the specter of defeat loomed ever closer. By now, Japan had been embroiled in the conflict for over 3 years, and the toll it had taken on the military and civilian population was staggering. The war had turned the Pacific into a furnace of destruction, where entire cities were reduced to rubble, and the civilian population was subjected to relentless air raids and starvation. For the soldiers and officers of Japan, the war had become a war of attrition, a matter of survival rather than conquest. In stark contrast, the Allies, chiefly the United States, the United Kingdom, and the other nations of the Pacific War, were steadily gaining momentum. With the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, the Allies were opening up new fronts in Europe, while simultaneously waging an unforgiving campaign in the Pacific. The United States, having already engaged Japan in a bitter conflict since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, was now slowly tightening its grip on the islands of the Pacific. The key to the American strategy lay not only in overwhelming force but also in the technological innovations that had begun to shape modern warfare. The United States had developed an impressive logistical network, which allowed them to maintain a steady flow of resources to their troops despite the vast distances of the Pacific. And more than just logistics, the Americans had begun to refine their methods of warfare with innovations in military technology and intelligence. In this theater of war, where every island fought to the last man, where terrain could be as dangerous as enemy fire, the ability to sustain troops and maintain a consistent supply chain was paramount. For the Japanese, however, the situation was dire. In the early years of the war, Japan's military had made significant technological advances, including their renowned aircraft and the development of highly skilled naval forces. However, by 1944 the tide had shifted. The Japanese Navy had been decimated at the Battle of Midway in 1942, and their air force was no longer the formidable force it had once been. With each island that fell to the Allies, Japan's defensive positions eroded, and the supply lines to their troops were increasingly cut off. It was during this period of mounting desperation that the Japanese military's leadership began to make key decisions that would shape the final years of the conflict. The Emperor Hirohito, though a largely ceremonial figure, remained a symbol of unity for the Japanese people. But his role in the strategic decision-making process was often one of symbolic presence rather than direct command. The real decisions came from the military leaders, who were tasked with defending the empire at all costs. Among the military leaders was General Hideki Tojo, who had served as the Prime Minister of Japan for much of the war. Tojo's hardline approach to the war was both his strength and his downfall. His insistence on continuing the fight at all costs, despite Japan's dwindling resources and manpower, led to many of the strategic mistakes that would ultimately bring about Japan's downfall. Tojo's failure to anticipate the full scale of American technological innovation and the economic might of the Allies compounded his mistakes, leaving Japan with few options in the face of American advances. However, amid the machinations of the leadership and the brutal fighting in the Pacific, there was a much more personal element to the war. The stories of individual soldiers on both sides, highlighted the stark contrast in how the Japanese and American forces approached combat, and more poignantly, the treatment of prisoners of war. It is here that the food question comes into play. For the Japanese soldiers, survival was paramount. They had been trained in the harshest conditions, often surviving on minimal rations and enduring physically grueling marches. The concept of sacrifice was ingrained into their psyche from the early days of their military service, and it reflected a broader cultural ethos of honor and duty. For the Japanese officers, many of whom were women, the stakes were even higher. These women were often sent to remote outposts or islands to serve in administrative or logistical roles. Despite their important contributions, they were frequently subjected to the same brutal conditions as their male counterparts. But it was not the physical exhaustion of war that troubled the Japanese officers the most. As the war dragged on, there was the growing realization that the American enemy, despite the brutality of the war, conducted itself in a manner that was fundamentally different. One of the most shocking revelations to many Japanese officers, especially the women, was the treatment of prisoners of war by the Americans. Unlike the Japanese, whose treatment of prisoners was notoriously harsh, the Americans often fed their prisoners the same food that their soldiers consumed. The Japanese military's treatment of POWs was dictated by the belief that they were the enemy and deserved no mercy. The Japanese POW camps were notoriously brutal, with starvation, disease, and forced labor taking the lives of countless prisoners. The Japanese officers, particularly the women, were raised in an environment that encouraged a complete dehumanization of the enemy. To them, the idea that the Americans would treat their prisoners with respect, offering them the same provisions as their own troops, was inconceivable. This stark contrast in treatment highlighted the deep ideological divide between the two nations. For the Japanese, it was a matter of survival, while for the Americans, it was a matter of principle. The Japanese officers, raised on the ethos of sacrifice and brutal militarism, could scarcely comprehend the mercy shown to prisoners of war by the Americans. It was this realization that would spark an emotional and psychological reckoning for many in the Japanese military, particularly the women officers who had seen firsthand the horrors of war. The idea that the Americans would feed their enemies the same food that they gave their own soldiers was not just a logistical decision. It was a reflection of the values that underpinned American military strategy. It was an approach rooted in the belief that war, as brutal and unforgiving as it was, should not strip away the humanity of those involved. To the Japanese officers, this was an affront to everything they had been taught about war, sacrifice, and honor. The revelation would ripple through the ranks of the Japanese military, forcing many to reconsider their own beliefs and actions. As the war raged on, the contrasting approaches to the treatment of prisoners would become a defining feature of the conflict, one that would ultimately shape the way the war was remembered in the post-war world. As the war pressed on, the disparity between the two warring factions, Japan and the United States, became more glaring, particularly in the psychological and moral spheres. It was not just the weapons, the strategies, or the leaders that defined this war. It was the deeply rooted values and ideals that each side held. The Japanese, driven by the militaristic ideals of their imperial army and the samurai spirit, viewed war as a totalizing commitment, a fight to the death for honor and the glory of the emperor. The Americans, in contrast, viewed the war through a lens shaped by democratic ideals and humanitarian principles, even in the midst of extreme violence. The juxtaposition of these two worldviews was highlighted by the very basic aspects of daily life during the war, one of which was the food served to soldiers and prisoners alike. To the Japanese officers, especially the women who were often tasked with overseeing logistical operations, the idea that the enemy would feed its prisoners with the same rations as their soldiers was anathema to the way they had been taught to view the enemy. The Americans, by contrast, adhered to a principle of providing equitable treatment to their prisoners, especially when it came to sustenance. This practice, although often born out of necessity, was a direct reflection of the American commitment to treating prisoners of war with dignity, even in the face of brutal hostilities. For many Japanese officers, the realization that American soldiers, who were fighting with the same level of intensity and aggression, would extend such care to their enemies was nothing short of shocking. In a military culture Where the concept of mercy for prisoners was virtually unheard of, the American policy stood out as an anomaly. The Japanese military had a brutal history of mistreating prisoners of war, with many Japanese officers and soldiers conditioned to believe that enemy prisoners had no value beyond their role as laborers, or at best as pawns in the struggle for survival. The difference in treatment of prisoners was not just a matter of military strategy, but of deep-seated cultural beliefs. The Japanese, under the Imperial Army's ideology, viewed surrender as dishonorable. It was considered a form of weakness, and those who surrendered were often viewed as less than human. Prisoners of war were frequently subjected to forced labor, starvation, and even death, as they were seen not as soldiers, but as the enemy, an enemy that could be discarded when it no longer served its purpose. The idea that the Americans would extend basic human decency to their prisoners, feeding them the same food as their own soldiers, was incomprehensible to many Japanese officers. The contrast between the two sides became even more pronounced as the war reached its bloody climax. The turning point for Japan came in 1945, with the defeat at the Battle of Iwo Jima, the firebombing of Tokyo, and the eventual dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These events shattered Japan's military and ideological resolve, but they also marked a dramatic shift in the way the Japanese military viewed their enemy. In the wake of these losses, the question of how the Japanese would reconcile with the American forces became pressing. The psychological impact of the war on Japanese officers was profound. Many had been raised on the belief that they were part of a superior military culture, one that was guided by honor and duty to the emperor. The brutal reality of the Pacific War, however, forced them to confront the limitations of their military philosophy. As they witnessed the destruction of their cities and the decimation of their armies, many began to question the wisdom of their approach to warfare. The idea that the Americans, whose military might had obliterated so much of Japan, could maintain a sense of honor and humanity in the face of such devastation was disorienting for many Japanese officers, particularly the women who had borne witness to the horrors of war firsthand. In the months following the war, as Japan struggled to rebuild and come to terms with its defeat, the question of food, how it was distributed, who had access to it, and who was denied it, became a symbol of the broader ideological divide between the two nations. The Japanese, who had fought and starved to defend their empire, were now forced to reckon with the Americans, who, in spite of their overwhelming technological and military advantage, had shown a level of compassion that was difficult for the Japanese to understand. This contrast in the treatment of prisoners had broader implications, especially for the Japanese officers who had been deeply entrenched in the Imperial Army's hierarchical structure. For many, the war was not simply about winning or losing. It was about the preservation of honor, both as individuals and as members of the Japanese nation. The idea of compassion, particularly toward the enemy, ran counter to the very fabric of their military identity. The Japanese officers, who had been taught to see the Americans as a faceless enemy, now had to come to terms with the reality that the Americans, at least in their treatment of prisoners, had a more humane approach to warfare. But it was not just the Japanese officers who were affected by this revelation. The American practice of feeding prisoners with the same food as soldiers became a symbol of the moral high ground that the Allies claimed to occupy during the war. For many of the American soldiers, the idea of providing prisoners with decent food was simply the right thing to do. It was an ethical stance grounded in the democratic values of their nation, a belief that the inherent dignity of all people must be preserved, even in the harshest circumstances. This policy, while not without its criticisms, was a reflection of the broader American belief that the war was not simply about defeating the enemy, but about upholding certain moral and ethical standards, even in the face of unimaginable violence. In this way, the treatment of prisoners and the food they were given became a microcosm of the larger ideological battle between the two sides. The Americans, who viewed the war as a fight for freedom, democracy, and human dignity, approached warfare with an ethic of mercy, even for those they considered enemies. The Japanese, meanwhile, saw the war through a lens of survival and sacrifice, where honor and duty to the emperor were paramount. The question of food, and how it was given to prisoners, became a pivotal moment in the conflict, highlighting the stark divide in values that would shape the post-war world. This moment, though seemingly small in the grand scale of the war, had profound implications. For the Japanese officers, especially the women who had been raised in a military culture steeped in sacrifice and brutal honor, the revelation of the American treatment of prisoners would have been a profound shock. It was a moment that encapsulated the cultural and moral rift between the two nations, a rift that would shape the course of the war and the post-war world. As the Pacific conflict drew to a close in the final months of 1945, the legacy of the war began to take shape in the most unexpected of ways. The human cost of the war was catastrophic, with millions dead and entire cities reduced to ashes. But even as Japan faced its ultimate defeat, the psychological and ideological aftermath of the conflict would leave a profound imprint on both the victors and the vanquished. In particular, the issue of how prisoners of war were treated and the contrast between the American and Japanese approaches to warfare would continue to resonate long after the final shots were fired. The aftermath of the war was marked not just by military victory, but by the deep moral questions raised by the actions of both sides. The horrors of the Holocaust, the use of atomic bombs, the bombings of cities, and the brutality of the Pacific Campaign all left the world grappling with the true costs of total war. But it was the contrast in the treatment of prisoners embodied in the simple act of feeding them that captured a central issue in the broader ideological struggle between the Allies and the Axis powers. For the Japanese, particularly the officers who had borne witness to the cruelty of their own side's treatment of prisoners, the realization of the Americans' contrasting policies was a difficult one to accept. The Japanese military, shaped by its long-standing traditions of Bushido and militarism, had always emphasized honor, sacrifice, and duty. This mentality had served them well in their early successes, but by 1945 it had become a double-edged sword. As the war dragged on and resources dwindled, the Japanese faced increasing difficulty not just in maintaining their military strength, but in holding on to their ideals of honor. The realization that the enemy they had vilified for years would treat its prisoners with dignity was a bitter pill to swallow. To many of these officers, the idea of compassion for enemies was not just foreign, it was unthinkable. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender in August 1945, with Emperor Hirohito's announcement of the unconditional capitulation and the signing of the formal surrender on the USS Missouri on September 2nd, the full scope of the war's impact began to take shape. Japan, devastated both physically and psychologically, was forced to confront its role in the war and its treatment of both the civilian population and prisoners of war. For the Japanese women officers, many of whom had served on distant islands far from the front lines, the war's end was a moment of profound reflection. They had witnessed the horrors of the conflict, the brutality of the battles, and the widespread suffering that had permeated every corner of their empire. And yet, as they processed the defeat, they were forced to reconsider their understanding of what it meant to fight for the emperor, to fight for honor, and to fight for the nation. How could the ideals of sacrifice and duty reconcile with the cold realities of war, the starvation, the brutality, and the overwhelming human cost? In stark contrast, the Americans emerged from the war victorious but also deeply scarred. The victory came at a cost, with over 400,000 American soldiers having lost their lives and entire cities reduced to rubble. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while ensuring Japan's surrender, also ignited fierce debates about the morality of using such a weapon. The Allies, particularly the United States, found themselves at a crossroads. The war had been won, but the long-term consequences, both in terms of global politics and the values upheld during the conflict, remained unclear. The Americans, despite their victory, were not untouched by the war. The experiences of the soldiers who had fought in the jungles of the Pacific and the fields of Europe left emotional scars that would last for generations. Many returned home, not to triumph, but to a world that seemed indifferent to the trauma they had endured. The cost of war in terms of lives lost and mental tolls taken was not easily forgotten. Yet, the principles on which the United States had built its military strategy, principles that included a more humane approach to prisoners of war, came to be seen as a point of pride. The treatment of prisoners of war, and the fact that the American military maintained its commitment to feeding prisoners with the same food as its own soldiers, would continue to be a subject of reflection. For the Americans, it was an act of empathy, a demonstration of what set them apart from the Axis powers. For the Japanese, it became a source of confusion, anger, and eventually deep regret. The contrast between the two approaches was stark. While one side viewed prisoners as disposable, to be exploited or abandoned, the other side saw them as human beings deserving of dignity, even in the most brutal of times. The post-war years saw a shift in global attitudes toward prisoners of war, with the Geneva Conventions and international human rights laws being strengthened to prevent the kinds of atrocities seen during the war. The revelation of the treatment of prisoners, particularly the Japanese officers' growing awareness of American policies, had a lasting effect on both Japan and the international community. The war's legacy, though defined by its violence, also became a turning point for how future conflicts would be waged. In Japan, the defeat brought about a period of occupation and reconstruction under the guidance of General Douglas MacArthur and the American-led Allied occupation forces. The country was forced to renounce militarism and rebuild from the ashes of its empire. The process of demilitarization, democratization, and rebuilding the nation's economy was long and painful, but it also led to the eventual rise of a more peaceful, stable Japan. The lessons learned from the war, especially the moral cost of war, would shape Japan's post-war identity. For the Americans, the legacy of World War II was one of triumph, but also one of immense loss. The nation emerged as a global superpower, but the trauma of the war, particularly for the soldiers who had returned home, remained an enduring presence. The psychological cost of the war would ripple through the fabric of American society, from the post-traumatic stress experienced by veterans to the broader societal shifts that followed the war's conclusion. In the decades that followed, as both nations tried to rebuild their societies and make sense of the horrors they had endured, the question of how war should be conducted and the treatment of prisoners remained ever relevant. The Americans had shown mercy to their prisoners, even when they were their enemies, and that decision would reverberate throughout history. It stood in stark contrast to the brutal, dehumanizing treatment employed by the Japanese and many of their Axis allies. The war may have ended, but the moral lessons of World War II would continue to shape the actions of nations for generations to come. And so, the story of how Japanese women officers were stunned by the American treatment of prisoners, how food, something so basic, became a symbol of the greater conflict between these two ideologies, remains a poignant reminder of the brutal, often incomprehensible nature of war. It serves as a testament to the complexities of human conflict and the enduring struggle for humanity, even in the most desperate of times.